Okay, I'll get started so that we can stay on time. Welcome, everyone. My name is Bree. I'm an assistant professor at Indiana University, Bloomington. Super excited for today's talk. We have Dr. Minga joining us about right hemisphere disorders as she sets up her stuff here. I'm going to drop a few links in the chat that we will be using today. Let me go ahead and put those in there. And I'll drop them in a few times because I know as people join, the chat doesn't necessarily carry forward. So I'll just make sure they're there for a few times. As we go through, it might be helpful if we all turn our videos off after our speaker introduces herself, just to reduce bandwidth a little bit. I know we're all on Wi-Fi somewhere or another. So without further ado, let me turn it over to our speaker and we can get started.
Hi. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamila Minga. I'm an assistant professor at North Carolina Central University and an adjunct assistant professor at Duke University. And it is a pleasure to speak with you this afternoon and provide an introduction for the exploration and possibilities of the RHDBank. I'll begin this presentation with a bit of an introduction, just kind of grounding what we do with the RHDBank. So as many of you know, stroke is the leading cause of disability in the United States, with about 45% of strokes resulting in damage to the right hemisphere. Communication impairments that result from deficits in both receptive and expressive language are a functional consequence of stroke. Yet for nearly 80% of right brain stroke survivors with impairments that affect communication, there are a host of unanswered questions about the specific ways that spoken language is impaired. Now, perhaps this stems from the lens through which we often think of impaired communication, or the way that impaired communication is viewed. I'll illustrate this using videos of two stroke survivors. Each stroke survivor is asked to tell us about the day that they had their stroke. As you look and listen, consider which of the two you might diagnose as impaired and why. First, here's Lydia.
Do you remember when you had your stroke?
Yeah, Seiko.
Yeah, could you tell me about it?
Oh, over again. Thank you. Oh, gone. gone. Speech. Words gone.
Okay, now let's just take a listen and look at Liara.
Do you remember when you had your stroke? Please tell me about it.
Well, I had a headache, and I went upstairs to lay down. Before I did, I took an aspirin, and I felt like it was stuck. So I went to get up to try to dislodge it, and I realized my whole left side was gone. So I never lost consciousness. I do remember the whole after evening. It was late night, like 11 o'clock, and they ended up taking me from Kennestown and life flighting me to Emory. So I got to ride the helicopter. That was kind of cool. But I do remember, that's the unusual thing about my stroke, is I didn't lose consciousness.
The traditional lens used to categorize impaired communication makes use of the effectiveness of basic elements of speech production, which are articulation, fluency, and grammar. Looking through this lens, I've witnessed professionals and the loved ones of stroke survivors make determinations that will label Lydia as impaired because she has an expressive aphasia. This lens is misleading and allows patients like Liara to masquerade as communicatively healthy, when in truth, communication is impaired. Liara, like most survivors of RHD, has apragmatism. Apragmatism is a disorder in conveying and comprehending meaning or intent that is appropriate for the communicative context. This means that in the presence of relatively preserved intelligibility, syntax, grammar, and fluency of expression, the ability to use language that is appropriate for the context and communication partner may be impaired. The functional impact of apragmatism can be seen in the lives of survivors like Liara, who recanted her experience during a 3-year follow-up appointment. In my office, Liara lamented about how changes in her communication affected her ability to relate to her spouse, her family, friends, and other loved ones. It is because of stories like Liara's, which are increasingly common, that there is an urgent need to understand the impact of RHD on communication. This brings us to the main topic of this talk. In recognizing the need, or this need for increased understanding, Dr. Melissa Johnson, Dr. Dorita Fromm, and I, in consultation with other leaders in the field, developed the RHD Bank. The RHD Bank is a national shared database of language samples, and it was conceptualized in 2016 to improve the rigor, quality, and reproducibility of language production research after right hemisphere stroke. The idea was that by creating a large standardized database of language samples of this very heterogeneous population, that we can make better and more precise predictions of deficit prevalence and inform the development of theoretically and empirically based assessments and treatment approaches. There are 3 main components of the RHD Bank. We have a comprehensive demographic survey, which includes information about education, work status, speech language treatment history, locus of lesion, and perspectives of communication capabilities. The other 2 components are the Discourse Protocol and the RHD Bank Grand Rounds, which are the focus of this presentation. So the RHD Bank Protocol includes 7 tasks spanning 4 different discourse genres, including narrative discourse, conversational discourse, procedural discourse, and descriptive discourse. Discourse tasks were selected based on the functional relevance to personal, professional, and social context, and those that highlight the pragmatic challenges of adults with RHD. Administration time for the full protocol is about 45 minutes, and the protocol begins with a consent to participate in answering any questions that the participant may have about the tasks that will be presented. This is followed by a warm-up conversation. And after a brief period, we then start the discourse tasks. So the participants complete first a free speech task with 4 guiding questions. And the guiding questions probe for information about the stroke event, communication abilities, and therapeutic interventions that the stroke survivor may have participated in. The questions that I have presented here are for adults with RHD, but there are different guiding questions for control participants as well. And you may reference the control protocol on the RHD Bank website, which I think is in the chat. Kennedy and colleagues' first encounter conversation is used for our conversational discourse samples. The first encounter conversation is a conversation between a participant and a newly introduced person. Typically, when I administer the protocol, it is with a student who has neither met nor heard of the study participant. For this task, participants are asked to get to know each other. There is no script for this task. We use Nicholas and Brookshire's cat rescue as a picture description task. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the cookie theft. So the third task is actually a descriptive discourse task. While the cookie theft picture has been updated since the development of the RHD Bank, we elicit language using the original version. And now for the Nicholas and Brookshire's cat rescue picture narrative task. For this task, we just ask the participants to tell us a story about the image that is presented here. For the story narrative task, participants are asked to look through a paperback book of Cinderella. You see the front cover of the text pictured here, and they are asked to look through the book to remind them of the story. After reviewing the book, they are asked to tell the story with the book closed and the book removed. And participants are generally allowed for 5 minutes to complete the story narrative. The peanut butter and jelly sandwich task is our procedural discourse task. And for Americans, this type of sandwich is common, but given the peanut allergies in younger generations, we may have to consider a different type of sandwich. But for now, the PB&J procedural discourse is used across different disordered populations. The final task of the RHDBank Discourse Protocol is the question production task. In this task, participants are asked to view each of the pictured objects individually and to generate questions, to generate at least 3 questions to determine the purpose of each of the pictured objects. It's important to know that I've already mentioned the peanut butter and jelly task that is used in other disordered populations, but the cat rescue and the Cinderella narratives are also used in other banks, and more specifically, they are part of the Rhd Bank and the Rhd Bank protocols. So this could allow for some comparisons across disorder. So far, we have collected more than 70 data sets, which is pretty exciting, and the database is growing. Most behavioral studies after RHD are single subject design or have less than 20 participants. This makes the RHD Bank the largest repository of language samples for adults with RHD or right brain stroke that I'm aware of anyway. Women make up the majority of our current sample, and only a portion of the language samples are available on the RHD Bank due to an embargo right now. It took a team of 4 to 6 graduate researchers at any given time to collect, transcribe, and code aspects of discourse. We also have a total of 3 institutional collaborators, myself at NCCU and Duke, and Dr. Melissa Johnson at Nazareth College, and Dr. R.G. Hillis at Johns Hopkins University. Discourse behaviors during various RHD Bank tasks are highlighted in the RHD Bank Grand Rounds using a case-based format. The purpose of the Grand Rounds is to enhance education concerning RHD communication impairments and co-occurring cognitive deficits through discourse production. Each case has a brief history as shown here, and the history is followed by a brief task description and task performance highlights for the reader. So after the history for the patient, we will have an example here is what I have pictured. Here's an example of Miranda's conversation task description and her performance highlights. In this section, we highlight the fact that Miranda doesn't ask a question of her conversational partner, and we call the attention of the reader to a potential impairment in memory and other pragmatic nuances that are demonstrated during her conversational interaction. For most of these, after the task summary is provided, we have an option for you to then view these specific discourse tasks. And we will just play a bit of Miranda's conversation for you, if I can get it started. And what I'd like you to, just a little background for Miranda. So we were in Miranda's home with 2 graduate students. One of the graduate students was kind of hanging out in another part of her home, which she told them that they could actually go to, so that she couldn't hear anything that was happening in the earlier parts of the administration of the protocol.
So this is Samantha. Hi. She scare ya?
Yeah.
So we're just here to get to know each other.
Okay, you mess. I forgot. Wow, that's what I was waiting for. I thought maybe she was going to the door. I thought maybe Dr. Minga was back.
No, I don't think they're back yet.
Threw me off.
So how long have you lived in Garner?
Since 2002.
Nice. So you like the area?
I do much better than when I lived in Durham.
Where'd you live at in Durham?
Near what used to be Durham Regional. I think it's Duke
Regional, yeah.
Regional now or something.
Yeah, I was actually born in that
Is that
hospital.
right?
Mhm. Yeah, many, many years ago.
Wow. I was right off Carver. And
Oh,
coming
nice.
down in front of Golden Corral and the credit union in housing development back there.
So what do you do in your spare time these days?
I like to read. I like listening to music. I'm involved in a few different ministries at my church. First aid ministry, senior ministry, homeless project, and missionaries. So there are different activities that go along with the various ministries, visiting sick and shut-in individuals, feeding, clothing the homeless with that project, and the senior ministry. That's kind of they just kind of get together, but just chance to socialize with other people and check in on them and that sort of deal. And then visiting with friends and family when opportunity presents itself. And I enjoy spending time with children. My sister has a little boy, he'll be 2 in August, so he's pretty entertaining when he comes.
Is that her only?
Okay, so that was just a portion of Miranda's conversation. The conversation went on for a number of minutes. Before I proceed, I want you to, in the chat, if you could, provide one word to describe her pragmatic skills. And I can't see the chat. Where is it?
Can you grab it?
Yes, please.
Okay, great.
Oh, there it is. Okay, we have roundabout, interviewee, distracted, fidgety, disjointed. What else? Anything else? Passive. What did you notice about her? Monotone. Okay. What else? Anything else? Okay. All right. So we have a number of different ways that you've described Miranda's conversation. And as part of the RHD Bank, we also provide more of these kind of questions to encourage discussion about what is actually viewed in the videos. So here I provide a screenshot of the questions for discussion that we have in the RHD Bank. And so the pragmatic one, I don't know if you recognized her eye contact. And you can respond in the chat. Did you notice her eye contact with respect to where the student was located? or approximate location of the student based on the initial part of the conversation and where her eyes were moving throughout the conversation. She seemed everywhere, but at the student. Yeah, she seems shifty. She was looking everywhere. Yes, she was looking everywhere. And you can imagine the functional implications of this, right? So our questions in the RHD Bank actually probe for more thought concerning these things. And also in the initial part of the conversation, you might have noticed that she was jumpy. She had forgotten that she told the student to go to another part of her home, which is another indication of a cognitive impairment that she displayed during this interaction. So the RHD Bank Grand Rounds kind of takes you through the discourse tasks and also takes you through some questions and some points of discussion for each of the cases that are presented. Here. Let me just, okay. All right. So now that I've introduced the RHD Bank Discourse Protocol and the Grand Rounds, let's consider how we might use them. I think that Brielle has pasted the link to a Jamboard, and I'm going to actually switch to the Jamboard as well. And you can actually pull the Jamboard up. And I'd like for us to go into the Jamboard and actually complete the different pages. So there are 3 pages for the Jamboard for each of the ways that the RHD Bank can be used. And I'd like you to share your ideas for the use of the RHD Bank, and more specifically, the Discourse Protocol and the Grand Rounds. I will give about 2 minutes or so for everyone to kind of add their sticky notes to the Jamboards. It doesn't matter which one. I'd like for contributions for all 3, if possible, so that you can just add the sticky notes for teaching, clinical practice, and research. There are arrows at the top for different frames, and there are 3 different frames. There's one for teaching, there's one for clinical research, and there's another for research. Okay, you can continue to add to the boards, but I want to just shift to what was placed on the boards so that we can kind of talk just a little bit about them. So for teaching, I see that so have students identify problematic behaviors and challenges with the discourse. So that is a very good one, and one that is also highlighted in the RHDBank grand rounds to structure class activities. So I'm wondering if who wrote that one, to structure class activities, if you can expound a bit on what you mean.
Hi, this is Laura Chapman. I wrote that one. I'll admit I'm new to Jamboard and on my phone, so I wasn't exactly, I don't think I saw everything, but I have one class to talk about RHD with my grad students. I teach a class that does assessment and treatment of aphasia and dementia and TBI and right hemisphere disorders in one semester.
Yeah.
So I literally just go straight through the grand rounds in RHDBank on my class day, and I use the questions. I don't share the link with the students so they can't preview and read through the questions and the answers until after class. But I use the grand rounds as it is on the website, and it's helpful.
Very good. Well, thank you, Laura, for using the grand rounds.
Yeah, the students love it. It's really great. Thank you for helping contribute to it.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, and so I say use the case studies to apply what is learned about RHD and increase observational skills. Yes, that kind of goes along with the other comment as well. Identify behaviors, graduate students on writing impressions, statements, characterizing language and cognitive deficits. Yes, absolutely. So it seems like everyone is in agreement that as far as the teaching anyway, that some options are to view exemplars of discourse and have the students characterize them and increase observational skills as well. Some other opportunities that might present themselves for the teaching aspect of the RHDBank could be to compare the discourse in the RHDBank to that of Aphasia Bank and that of TBI Bank. I mentioned earlier that 3 of the tasks in the RHDBank Discourse Protocol are also part of the protocols for those 2 specific banks. So that can be another way to actually, tease out the behaviors or what is distinguishable about RHD communication. You can also use it to generate ideas for treatment approaches that could be measured using the Discourse Protocol. I think, as someone has already put here, to measure student learning as well, and to generate just an appreciation for the impairments. So just a few for teaching. And now we will move on to clinical practice. So for clinical practice, I see here assess after any brain injury, not just left hemisphere. Yes. And to provide education to patients and families. Now, that is a really, really good one, and I think is particularly important to survivors of right hemisphere stroke and their loved ones, because I can't tell you how often the patients that I work with, they weren't told anything about the communication impairments that could result, or in the way that the dynamics of communication could change after right hemisphere stroke. And that proved to be pretty detrimental to their daily functioning. So that's a pretty important one. To educate students and practicing clinicians about the best practices of assessing and treating RHD based on the latest research findings. Absolutely. So something that I didn't mention that is a part and probably needs to be updated at this point, another aspect of the RHDBank is we have some literature that's cited at the end of the grand rounds that talks about the different cognitive and communicative pragmatic impairments that result after RHD. Sharing potential communication difficulties with other disciplines. I really like this one. So when we think about best practices and also kind of the team approach to treating these patients, making sure or ensuring or assisting other healthcare practitioners, including physicians and physical therapists, occupational therapists, respiratory therapists, that these communication changes can occur and do occur, and that they should definitely be acknowledged and targeted in some shape or form. Teaching students to quantitatively and qualitatively navigate RHD. Now, who wrote that one? Now, I like that one, but I want you to expound just a bit, if you could.
That was me, Bree. We talk a lot about like the process-oriented model of, getting number data, but also observing things beyond number data. Kind of what you were walking us through, like eye contact, which is, not as immediately quantifiable in terms of like number of words, but really going with a more holistic point of view and really taking in the whole picture of what they're seeing.
Yes, absolutely. These are some really good points of use of the RHD Bank. And you've pretty much covered most of what I actually had listed. So we've talked about increasing the understanding of communication behaviors in adults with RHD and practicing clinicians, physicians, and just healthcare practitioners to provide a resource for professionals to evaluate patients, perhaps, as compared to others with RHD or even to healthy controls. We can expose clinical fellows who may not have taken Laura's class and get that exposure to the RHD Bank, or maybe they have never had an exposure to right hemisphere brain damage, and we can expose them using the RHD Bank to the population. And we can also, within clinical practice, just by the knowledge gained from the RHD Bank and the analysis that we can do, we can probably stimulate the development of assessment tools that are novel and specific for this population. All right, and finally, the third page for research. Not so much on research, but that's okay, because clinical turns into research. So let's see. All right, so we have the role of pragmatics in return to work activities. Oh my goodness, who said that one? That is so very important. I will share with you that in the population that I work with, and I keep in contact with all of my right brain stroke survivors that participate in my research. And I will tell you that of those that were working prior to having their stroke, they are no longer able to work. And there are a number of reasons for that, but pragmatic communication or pragmatic aspects of communication are pretty consistent across that group. And so who wrote the role of pragmatics in return to work? Can you expound upon that one a little?
Sure. I'm Karen Kinderman. I wrote that just thinking about, patients who I work with who are very excited about getting back to work, but are so limited by their pragmatics. And part of that piece of that is their awareness of how their pragmatics are impacting their return to work, and awareness of how they may need to refocus their attention on what type of work would be good for them, that they still have great skills they can use, but maybe just shifting how they're approaching it.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Pragmatic skills are so important to the pragmatism, which is a term that I'm beginning to use for the communication impairments that we see after right hemisphere stroke. So others here, we have that we can have greater degrees of standardization in protocol and in analysis. Yes, absolutely. Greater standardization and also the development of population-specific assessment tools. Absolutely. And yes, so we can identify language and communication behaviors that can be used to assess and treat the RHD cognitive communication impairment. So that is a really good one as well. And I'll actually use that one to transition back to my PowerPoint where we talk a little bit more about the research perspective, and specifically to this point for the person that wrote the Defined Language Communication Behaviors that can be used to assess and treat the RHD communication impairment. Can you expound a bit on that?
Hi, Jamila, it's Davida. I was not set up as a plant on that. And you know what? I'm actually going to bounce it back to you and let you expound on it, because you have done a lot of that work and you have really good ideas about it clinically. So I'm going to just bounce it back to you, but thanks.
Well, thanks. I kind of figured, I thought it might be you, but I was not sure.
Same way.
So in transitioning then, I will tell you that in my lab, I have primarily focused on two of the discourse tasks, the question and production task and the conversation task. Now, the fact is that there are certain communicative actions that we take to get to know another person. One action that we take to accomplish this goal is to ask questions. Now, you might have noticed that the conversational partner with Miranda, within a few seconds of the conversation, asked a question. Miranda was engaged in the conversation for about 9 minutes, or maybe even a little more, and did not ask a question to get to know her conversational partner. She demonstrated, or would probably be perceived as being egocentric in this vein. And so you might also consider the functional impact of reduced question asking, for example, during dinner or in social situations or at work. And so it's my belief that the RHD Bank can be used to actually exploit some of the probably, I won't say that they're subtle, but maybe things that we haven't looked at before with respect to language production. And in my lab, I have focused on question use. And so the observation of reduced question asking during conversation, coupled with the specific syntactic form of questions, made me think that questions could be amenable to diagnostic applications. And this led me to focus on my analysis. For my analysis, I look at 3 broad types of questions. And this is based on a published coding scheme. I look at alternative questions, which an example of that could be, are you a Duke fan or a Carolina fan? And then there are polar questions, which are typically your questions that elicit a yes/no response. And an example is, are you from North Carolina? And then content questions, which are typically what we think about when we think about questions. And these are your who, what, where, when, how, why, how much, how many types of questions. And so when I looked at the question production task of the RHD Bank, we found a significant difference in the distribution of questions by type, and specifically that polar questions, those questions that elicit yes/no responses, were used significantly less. During conversations, adults with RHD asked significantly fewer questions overall, which is unsurprising. And again, significantly fewer polar questions than controls. So within my work, the RHD Bank has been useful for characterizing apragmatism in novel ways, and more specifically with respect to question production. So the core corpus and consortium membership for the RHD Bank is growing, with some goodwill contributions that consist of recorded language samples using the protocol and some of those that do not use the protocol. I welcome you to ask survivors to enroll in the right brain stroke research registry. The registry was a brainchild of my dissertation because I had so much difficulty identifying and acquiring enough participants in my research and recruiting them for research participation that I vowed that I would not go from state to state to get participants anymore, that I would develop the RHD Bank, the Right Brain Stroke Research Registry. And the link is here, and I think it's also in the chat. For the registry, it can be anyone from ages of 18 to 75, and we want registry participants to be those that have had a right brain stroke and those that have not had a right brain stroke. If you'd like to become a part of the consortium, it's open to faculty and clinicians, and faculty and clinicians can contact Dr. Brian McWeeny, and I have the address here, and provide your name and contact information, your professional affiliation, as well as why you want to access the database. Now, once you have contacted Brian and registered to access the database, a username and passwords are distributed for both the grand rounds and the database. There are some ethical principles that we ask that you share with, that you actually review and share when you're using the grand rounds as well as the database. And with the database, you will have access to all of the videos, transcriptions, demographic data, and test results, so that you may actually take full advantage of the resources that are available. You might even decide to assist in corpus development, and you can do that in a number of ways. You can create your own corpus. I have a Minga corpus. You could create your own corpus. You could also send videos of your patients or individuals that have right hemisphere brain damage and just dump them into the database so that everyone can view and maybe even facilitate analysis of those particular samples. If you're using the RHDBank in the classroom, I also encourage you to send your classroom activities and assignments so that we can all use them, or even, access the activities, so that we can have a collective approach to using the RHDBank. And finally, if you use the data in the RHDBank and you present or send posters, please share those with us as well. And we will add them to the growing database. All right, so that concludes my talk. Thank you so very much. My sincerest gratitude to my funding sources, institutional supports, my graduate students, and community partners who make this work possible. It cannot be done in a silo. And so I'll take any questions that you have. Thanks.
Thanks, that was awesome. If you'd like to unmute, you're very welcome to, if people have questions, or you're very welcome to add them in the chat if you're somewhere where you can't unmute. So I will go ahead and just defer to anyone who has questions. Definitely got some praise in the chat going.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Brand new faculty excited. So I have a question I can kind of kick off with here. In terms of what what are some next steps that you're looking at for research? How are you starting to look at some of these kind of multimodal aspects? You mentioned kind of eye shifting, and how are you starting to integrate that with what you've done in terms of speech and also some of your pragmatics research?
Yeah, so great question, Brielle. And I wish that I was looking at multimodal right now. I'm kind of slow walking it through the linguistic pieces. So I didn't say in the beginning, but my background is in linguistics. So I majored in linguistics and chemistry, and I have a love for the sociolinguistic aspect. So most of my work is focused on the linguistic pieces, although I think that the multimodal, kind of looking at the extra linguistic and paralinguistic components as they merge or work together in the communication is vitally important. My work now is still linguistic, but I'm moving more to the neuroanatomic correlates and associations of different behaviors so that we can try to maybe find a more objective way, for example, for physicians to kind of to signify that a deficit could exist. And so that's where my research is headed right now, although the multimodal is fascinating and I think very important for this particular population.
All of those sound super exciting. I won't take up all the time. Does anyone else have questions?
Okay, someone is asking for a handout, and I can actually just PDF the presentation and I can send it to Brielle. I'm not sure how.
Yes, let's go ahead. I can link it on the website also, because we always say whoever has talked. And if anyone would like, I forgot to add at the beginning, a letter confirming their attendance to this. I know some people need it for continuing hours for licensure. Go ahead and just send me an email. My email should be on the website, or I'll pop it in the chat here, and I can get you a letter of attendance too, and also disseminate that PDF.
Okay. All right. And all right. Any other questions? I'm so excited that you're excited about the RHD Bank.
I think there's a lot of excitement happening in the chat. So we're not CEU certified just yet, but a lot of people use this time toward the CMHs for ASHA or state licensure, but CEUs we're working on.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Julianne. I wondered what the next steps you saw as far as the linguistic research might be. I know you were looking into questions specifically, but were there other areas where you saw a lot of differences in the conversation tasks?
Well, I have not specifically looked at them, but I'm looking at the contribution to the conversation as a baseline. So, for example, whether or not there are comments or continuers, and those are like your mm-hms and your uhs, as well as some pause sequences within the turn taking for the conversation. So I would say that my next steps from the linguistic side will be to look at more of the speech acts and turn taking, specifically for the conversation anyway.
That's great. I think that'll be so informative for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think so too. You know, conversation it's one of those, you can't get around conversation, right? And we know that after right hemisphere brain damage, that conversations can be, pretty impaired, but the specifics of what makes them impaired, other than kind of anecdotally recognizing that something is off, is where we need to go.
I think this is Bev Miller, and I just wanted to say that I was just trying to think how to say pretty much what you just said. That I think some of what I liked about the presentation was a way to to have conversations, and that now there might be a tool that we can share with people, because I also find that sometimes people with RHD communication problems and their families know that something isn't right, but they themselves don't know how to explain to you that it isn't what they were like before. And when you do the testing and everything on a test seems okay, but it doesn't really match with what they tell you, it can just be so challenging. I think this is really exciting.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Beverly. Yeah, I think so too. And we have to figure out how to quantify these very qualitative changes that occur after right hemisphere brain damage. They are functionally, detrimental to the daily functioning of the survivors and their loved ones.
All right, it looks like we've got lots of lots of fun future directions, I guess is the best way to put it, and hopefully lots of collaboration as well. I know that probably everyone here is interested in next steps, so keep up to date with RHD Bank and everything else that's happening on TalkBank, which is constantly changing, which is just an invaluable resource. So I think everyone can join me in saying a huge thank you for this awesome talk, and we will see you all on future Focus Aphasia events. And again, my email's in the chat if anyone needs a letter for today, and just join me in thanking Dr. Minga for this awesome talk.
Thank you all.
I'm going to jump in. Bree, I think there was one other chat that question.
Oh, was there? Did I miss one?
Overlap between diagnosis of autism and right CVA in school-age children.
So with respect to the diagnosis, so I can speak from a pragmatic perspective, right? There is some overlap with behaviors pragmatically with the within the autism literature and that of what we see in right hemisphere brain damage. So yes and no. There are some, differences with respect to the, of course, autism is more developmental and right hemisphere brain damage is because of an acquired injury, but there are definitely some similarities and a bit of overlap with respect to the pragmatic language impairments.
That one. Good catch, Davida.
Yeah, thanks. And I would also say that, there's interesting comparisons, overlaps with the TBI population as well. And, this is, I think this is part of some future directions as well. We can learn from these other populations in terms of research that's been done and clinical work that's being done, and we can, give and take. We can trade back and forth, but we can learn in places where there are overlaps and then look for the distinguishing characteristics as well, because, we're just trying to go at this whole, trying to crack this nut of, communication from all the different angles. And there is still, there's so much we know, but there's also still so much to learn. So this gives us a chance to really try to, dig in.
Yeah, and definitely increase awareness, right? That it is a thing, right? And that communication impairments occur regardless of the hemisphere of stroke in different ways, but they still occur.
Absolutely. On that note, I'm going to pause our recording.